So the venture capital unit's been around for about 4.5 years, and we're essentially speed dating international investors, quite a lot of corporates, and UK technology companies. The reason we're doing that is to ensure that investors are fully aware of the opportunities in the UK, and to encourage them to take some of those up by joining the dots and putting those companies in front of them. Obviously, it's good for UK companies as well. They get strategic investment quite often, which helps them grow financially, but often a lot of advice and expertise that helps them expand and export much quicker. We've got a number of key markets where we work with investors. There's quite a few named there, the main ones obviously being USA, Japan, Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong at the present. For anyone who doesn't know or is familiar with the differences between VC and corporate VC, so venture capital is quite often about generating returns, and that's probably, if you've been through a round, you might have experienced that. So it's really around how much money are you going to make the investor. Now the benefits of that is it's completely unaffiliated. So you're not going to bias your customer base, ultimately your commercial traction, by having a particular investor on board. Another upside can be if you've got a notable LP in there, so a notable limited partner and investor in the fund. Sometimes, because it's within their fund, they'll actually be well connected themselves, having been in the investment community for some time. A downside, though, is you will be measured on financial performance because the fund is measured on financial performance. Some are evergreen, so they keep rotating, and whatever money that they get from their portfolio, they re-inject that into new activities. Some have say a 4-year lifetime where they really want to make some good investments, do a bit of follow-on, and then look at how that fund's performed. Corporate VC, however, is quite a different thing. So this is the venture arms of very large corporations, and some of them will set up completely separate bodies, if you like, institutions. Some will invest off their balance sheet, so you wouldn't actually know that they have a VC arm, but they would be doing investments. Now they can help with getting access to markets naturally. If they're a very large corporate and they're relevant to whatever you're developing, then they can help open a lot of doors and perhaps be a first mover or an early adopter, or encourage parts of their supply chain to also work with you. They can also help you in terms of taking a product forwards. That's quite useful if there's capital involved as well, because they'll have a lot of hardware themselves and a supply chain in place, which they can usually leverage if they wish to. They could be a potential acquirer. That's often been a view, but it's actually, the statistic is only something like 4% of companies that get invested by a particular company actually go on to then be acquired by that company. Certainly I'm aware of companies that, for example, Siemens invested in, and then happily, amicably, GE bought that company. In terms of influence on customers as well, and I guess that's your customer base, having a corporate on board might be useful, but it depends where they sit in the supply chain. So, if you've got 3M, the chemicals company, as your investor, you might struggle to get BASF as a potential customer, simply because of the strategy and the indicators and the competition in the market. However, obviously, if you were doing, say, a material for televisions, you might get 3M on board, but then you might also get Panasonic. So you get a nice mix of corporates involved, which can often be a very beneficial match within getting venture funding. So this is the range of investors that we work with within the venture capital unit. Most of the great and the good, as you might imagine. Some of these names you might recognize, some may be less so. So you get certain names that you wouldn't necessarily recognize, like In-Q-Tel, which sounds a little bit interesting. It's actually the venture arm of the CIA. But then you've got, Merck, you've got Nokia. They've actually got a slightly different name for their VC fund. Syngenta, Takeda, Tata. So quite a broad range around the world that we work with. It's worth specifying probably that we work with them to understand their interests and how we can match companies that we see with them. And my role is to actually ensure that we put forward suitable companies that match their criteria. Excuse me. So it's understanding what they're interested in, but it's not like a club, so we wouldn't just do a round robin to everybody in the list. It's actually a case of targeting the ones that we know would have a specific interest relevant to what a company is involved in. So the way we work is through, in the Venture Club unit, we do one-to-one introductions between companies and investors. We also run a number of pitch events during the year. So these can be for particular investors that we think can do more in the UK. So Intel, maybe Siemens, maybe Salesforce. Understand what they're interested in, and then actually pull together some companies to come and meet them over the course of a day. And we also do, as well as running these days for particular corporates, we run it for a specialist audience. So we'll bring together investors in a particular sector throughout the year, and again, bring together companies to come and pitch to them on a more open basis to an audience. So we've got one on cybersecurity coming up. Other ones this year have been in artificial intelligence, big data analytics, and digital health. So quite a broad coverage of areas. The criteria that we used that I mentioned to ensure that even at the outset we're working with companies that are going to be relevant for the investors, and this has been honed over the last 4 years, well, 5 years I guess, is companies that are operating and headquartered in the UK, have something unique at a stage it's going to be relevant, and raising a few million and up. So I think the largest at the moment is around a 50 million D round, but it's more around the amount and the maturity. And part of this is my role is to actually explore how that stacks up and the sort of messages that we can give investors. So that's our real aim, and that's really the purpose of this webinar, is to give you some of my experience from assessing companies. I've been involved in innovation and technology appraisal for 10, 15 years perhaps, from very early days and the very start of my career, looking at competition and new technologies in power generation, but then moved through quite a lot of sectors, and certainly doing DD work for due diligence work for investors. So that's the outset of what VCU does. But in terms of messaging, and this is really how I explore companies, but also how they pitch. They're two sides of the same coin, I think. So pitching is really around what you say and how you say it. It sounds straightforward, but it's more complicated news than you might imagine, I would expect. So what you say is pretty important. Now, one of the pieces of advice I would give is to think like your audience. Investors are very happy to meet you. They smile, they'll greet you, but you're really in competition, and they are really wanting to cut through. So, depending on how you're talking, they might be picking out one in every 3 or 4 words that you say and assembling a much shorter sentence that actually is your pitch and your offer. So they're piecing things together much as I would. And it's sort of a bit of a murder mystery sleuth, so they can get the messages they want to hear and extract that from what you're actually telling them. So one of the things I would say is assume that they're really against you, and that will help you position yourselves in a much more stronger light. So don't just walk in all cheery and happy and angelic. I'd assume that they're really against you. You're effectively on trial in many respects at this stage. And I've mentioned bingo there simply because there are so many people saying so many words that an investor will want to cut through those quite quickly, and actually can be a strong distraction because the clock's running when you're in there, you're using up their time. So in terms of thinking like your investor or potential investor, you're a risk. You're a risk of their success. They're interested in successful technology development, successful partnerships, perhaps returns on the fund, and involving you could be a big risk to that. And if they don't know you, then you certainly are a risk. So it's not just what you say, it is certainly how you say it. So that, you might have something very compelling, but if you can't pitch it to your investor, well, can you pitch it to your customers? Can you pitch it to people you want to bring on board as non-executive directors, etc.? So just the way that you pitch something is pretty important. The proposition in itself is, of course, important. Is it compelling? Is it something that people want? Can you express it in a way that people actually want it and justify that? One other aspect is, of course, people. People do talk about team traction and technology, and quite often in that order. If you've got a brilliant person who's had several startups and big exits, then they're already over the line in terms of credibility. If they haven't quite got there yet, but the traction is they've got some massive partners on board, then again, it's probably something compelling. And actually, the new and interesting thing from your perspective is actually could be potentially the smaller aspect for the audience. Also, within people, it's worth understanding whether there are people that that can help you get to market. So there are companies which seem very small, very embryonic, if you like, but then suddenly they score more points, if you like, in terms of my view of them, because they'll mention that they've got the ex-director of Microsoft on the board, and he's helped them open up their trials network. So I mean, certainly there was a customer who was telling me about all their work, and about half an hour in, I was exploring who they'd done an assessment on, and it was people at Microsoft, and I was exploring how they got in there, and lo and behold, they knew someone very senior in Microsoft who had seen what they were doing and was backing it. So again, these types of things are quite useful. Protection obviously is quite an interesting one, because you move out of a home market perhaps and you're into very interesting territory. You're swimming with sharks, you're swimming with the world at the VC level. So if you have got a great pitch, you've demonstrated there's a great market, what's to stop someone else coming away and taking away all your good work by simply taking over whatever it is that you've developed and justified that there is a market for. Naturally, on progress, you've got with everything's stacking up as well, and the plans is really around how you're going to get things to market. I think one of the interesting concepts is the distance from market as well as the route to market. So how far away are you? What do you need to line up before things happen? And I first saw this back in 2003 with fuel cells and hydrogen systems. So this is novel fuels and incredibly clean and efficient. And looking at a fuel cell company, it was great what they could do, but even if they got it working perfectly, there was no hydrogen available, and hopefully that would come along 5 to 10 years later. So, the general picture suddenly becomes transparent. It's how you tap into a great big barrel full of money and what needs to line up for you or somewhere else in that supply chain to start accessing that. And finally, pounds. And by that I mean how much investment you've had and how much you're asking for, and whether the whole thing actually looks suitable. In terms of compelling, actually, is it worth me stopping there just for any questions? Would that be useful? I don't know if my colleagues on the line, what they would think. Guessing not.
Compelling then. Right now, no comments, no questions so far.
Okay, so we've got the comments and questions. Sorry, I should be looking at that. I'm an amateur, sorry. So compelling, I'd say subjective. Don't make it subjective. I looked at one this morning, which surprised me, but it just made this very clear for me. So you have got something really interesting and new. And they had something in their pitch that the first line said, "We are the world leaders in this." So we're the world leaders in something new and novel that you've never heard of. You know, if it was something that you had heard of and you knew exactly what we're doing, we're probably further along the track. So, you know, be careful about your wording. Really try and, you know, I had the devil's horns up, really try and cut to the chase here. Quite often when I'm working with companies, I'll get to the point. Either they get it quite quickly, or they might not. But some of them I say, look, this is a waste of time. You clearly have nothing here. You're not progressed. There's no USP. They get a little bit shirty, and then they say something, and then we say, write that down, and then they get it. So try not to use something, you know, it's not compelling to say something that's subjective. The bingo words don't really help. They just help position you within an investor's mind. That is quite interesting, to be able to ensure that an investor can pigeonhole you and compare you with other companies that they might be aware of, because don't forget, their job is looking for interesting companies in their space. And if they're looking at you, they're probably looking at other companies from other parts of the world as well. So you know, these are the things that are quite relevant. So I've made a couple of them here. So we're leading edge, but again, relative to what? Unless I can state something, some metrics behind that, it is quite subjective. I get companies talking about things being patented, and then I say, okay, where are they granted? Well, they're not yet, but we put in the application. In which case it's not patented, it's a patent applied for, and they're very different things. And it's an indication of the cost and effort that's likely to go before the company. Cost savings always interesting, but relative to what? Because if you look at well, the life cycle, you might save, you know, a significant amount of money at a particular point, but the change out could be incredible for these companies. You know, how much have they got locked into capital? What is the cost for changing their whole supply chain? It's worth considering that. And things that are easy. Yeah, again, it comes back to the whole picture. How much needs to change for you to actually have an impact on a customer's business? Bragging rights, right? So this is really where you really want to go in there, assuming that the investor doesn't like you at all, you're not credible, and you really are a distraction, and you're keeping him from getting his lunch. So things that you might find that you can say. So, I mean, one of the things, I was working with a cyber company, and they had something interesting, This guy had moved company to join them, and he said, well, I was looking at them, and I think they were interesting. That's really not going to be that compelling, but I then asked him, well, where did the founder get the idea? And he said, while at McAfee, he found this, this, and this. So this guy was going around with lots and lots of customers, looking at their installations, working out what the issues were. He'd identified an issue. So straight away, you've got experience and you've got a credible name. So these sorts of things certainly build up a picture. Being in paid trials is very different to being in trials. And the whole talking to that almost every company in the world is talking to. You get people at research level who are interested in new technologies, and they'll talk to everyone. And yes, they'll spend 5K on a little bit of research, because why wouldn't they? Because it's not going up to their director for sign-off, so it's just a bit of a research project. So it's worth exploring. You know, certainly I would do that from assessing a company, getting under the skin of what exactly is meant by working with someone or talking to someone. Some of them can be, well, they've just signed a 3-year commitment to develop with us, and some of them are, we met them at a conference and yeah, we're talking to them. So some other examples there of other things that are relevant in terms of bragging rights. This is going in, assuming that you're really on a back step and about to get thrown out of there, and you know you really want to make this big impression. What are your bragging rights? What can you really brag about that makes you different, and what's the claims? I'll quickly cover defensibility. So it's really around the technology, as I mentioned, around know-how, patents, and copyright. There's different forms of intellectual property. It's not just all about patents. You might have just tacit knowledge, so you've got a bunch of people which have an awful lot of knowledge. access to the market as well is particularly relevant. And again, this is defensible. So I work with a company that had a technology which had no patents. And it was a bit of a struggle because it was a capital project, so it was hardware. But they then went on to say they'd been in 5-year trials and they'd been working with one of the major electricity companies on those trials. And those trials in themselves are very, very expensive. So if you demonstrate this, and again, it's one of those things, you demonstrate there's a market and then you're closing the door behind you so no one else can follow you, or you're making it really rough terrain for them. So that would be some advice there. I'll skip through this briefly, but it's really around value chain, and it's how you get that over. So, you know, I'll just quickly talk about that example about a bike chain. You know, if you're developing a bike chain, that's great. You're essentially creating a service which connects gears, and ultimately, with a little bit, you've actually got exercise and mechanical condition data. So it's how much of the value chain you can capture, and you don't want to be beholden to what you're trying to push forward. It's always quite an interesting perspective on an investor panel to see which companies know themselves extremely well. They understand why customers want to work with them, what the value is, and the overall value that the customers want can often be the real value in that company. So you can be a supplier into a company, a customer, and have them extract all the value, or you can know that value and work out how you're going to monetize it. Naturally going through your customer in some form, but it's how you know, where you draw the revenue split from what you make and what they're going to make from what you can provide them. This is a bit of a mind map I produced a little while ago, but it still holds up pretty well. I won't spend too long on it, just conscious of time, but it's really, you know, I mentioned you're a risk, so how much of a risk actually are you? And there's various areas of what constitutes a risk. So it's around, as you can see on here, whether there's a strong product, whether it's defensible, whether there's the right team delivering it, and there's a large addressable market here as well, because you know what get you there won't get you any further. Sometimes I forget the proper phrase for this, but for example, there was a company I was working with, which had an interesting proposition in vehicles. And they managed to pull together their trial because their chief execs were in the industry. It was actually to do with buses. So they pulled together their very good panel in buses, and that got them up their trials up and running in the UK. What they didn't realize is when they say we're going to the USA next, well, what got them to succeed in the UK for these early trials was access to the people. And in the USA, they had no access to anyone. So these are the things that you know that might count against you in terms of a risk. You can't simply say we're expanding to the USA, because the counter to that will be, well, how exactly? Because what got you into the marketplace you don't have in your other markets. I won't go through these necessarily. I think, well, they'll be in the recording, and also I think the slides might be shared as well. So looking at the market potential, there's lots of different things that you know, you might get into different verticals. You might prioritize a particular market to get revenues from it, even though it's not your target market. If it's generating revenues, that's always a good sign. Somebody out there wants it, and that's going to help you accelerate your development into your target market. You can also have market potential and protected access through customers, people on the board, people you know, and some of the other points there, regulation. And one of the things that always comes up is grants and awards. They're a useful indicator, but they don't quite go into the same diligence that an investor might. So it's good to see a bit of recognition, but they'll always be taken with a pinch of salt. The team, naturally, whether it can execute. A company had a really interesting product, good team behind it, covering all the bases. The only thing they lacked was someone who could give them access to the market. And actually that meant, because it was in automotive, that was going to be a major struggle for them. So, you know, it's how far you are along, if you like, on a hockey stick type curve, and that's going to set them back because they need to find a way into their target market. There's quite a bit about the strong product there, but it's whether it's protected, how far along you are, whether it's manufacturable. I mean, there's certainly in hardware, there's 3 different levels. Everyone knows generally technology readiness, and then you've got manufacturing readiness. Can you actually manufacture this thing? But actually, the major thing is system readiness. Is the system able to be deployed? Because if you consider you're going to retrofit this into something else, unless it's completely standalone, is the other system able to connect and absorb and work with it? And a little bit about viable growth as well. But the other part to this is your proof points in validation. So these are all things that will be looked at and assessed when you're giving a pitch. I've just mentioned the 3 stages there, which is quite relevant. So early on, you're working out whether it works in the business. Later on, you're working out whether the market actually wants it. Ideally, you might do those in parallel. And finally, you've got the business, and this is where you get further along in terms of maturity, that the whole business stacks up. So that means your business model, your revenue model, the way the team's running, everything stacks up. That's a little bit more detail in how this might look. So in the bottom left, you've got the technology is proven. You're then taking it to markets, and the market becomes validated, and then you're expanding and rolling out. The interesting aspect here is the intellectual content, and that is really where the defensibility is. Things in digital media, they can get very quickly to revenues and customers. The converse of that, of course, is the capital lock-in. So if you get something into a vehicle, you're probably in there for 5 to 10 years, if not more, with some sort of R&D and continued development. So there's a certain aspect to substitution, but also countering that with very quickly being able to get to revenues and expand. So it's generally to do with capital and the amount of time and money you need to invest to get something ready to market. In terms of how you say it, the interesting bit. So you're taking your investors on a wonderful journey. There's a wonderful picture. You walk in, the sun's shining, it's great, and there's a nice wiggly path, and you're taking them on a journey, and this is you, this giant mountain, a lot of unknown. So there's a couple of ways to do that. You can start at the bottom. You can start right at the bottom, and it looks pretty interesting, and I'm not sure which path you're going to go, and I can't even see which direction you're really going to go in. Sometimes it's useful to start at the bottom if that's where your bragging rights really are. You know, we've got 20 PhDs in quantum physics, and we're a quantum physics company. But even then, it supports something. It's a supporting point. So this is, you know, this looks, well, for me, this looks pretty hard work. I'm tired already. This is much better. Look at that. Beautiful clouds, wonderful scenery. I could quite happily take a stroll down this mountain. It might take me the same amount of time to get up, but it looks much better. So I strongly suggest working out what the peak is. Start there. It's a much more pleasant journey. Nokia had a technology program which involved 5 whys, and I'd certainly suggest you do some of that as well. So you are wanting to come across as this pinnacle of interest in a noisy background of every other company that's banging on the door wanting to talk to an investor. If you look at this tower, it's interesting to see the midsection. The midsection is very interesting. It's this lattice of steel. It's only got one job, and that's to hold up what's above it. And then what's above that is there to hold up what's above it. And yes, it's a wonderful place. I do like visiting there, but it's a giant tower, and the bit at the top is the real peak. Everything else is there to support it. So do ask yourself when you're pitching, so what? Why? I don't get as abrupt as so what sometimes, but I get facts and figures, and I do honestly think so what, and I'll go through it with a company to the point that they tell me so what. And then that's where we begin. And that is actually the peak of the mountain, if you like. That's where you want to start. So do think about putting things together in that way and try and distill a single sentence USP. Everyone talks about the elevator pitch, but it's actually something which is invaluable, and it comes from taking a negative point of view. and actually not saying, how do I get my message across, but actually, what do they want to hear? What does the investor, what does the audience want to hear from me that's going to grab their attention? This was an interesting example, which was a technology company I looked at. So, I mean, their pitch covered various things, including emails being, misaddressed emails being a #1 security issue, and their technology prevents emails being sent to the wrong people, which is great. But those 2 points then support a final point, which we then distilled, which was this company prevents the #1 data security issue. Now that grabs my attention. I might then go back and say, well, actually, the issue that we're talking about is the #1 issue, and the way we do it is through using this clever AI. So I mean, do try and distill things as much as you can, and as simple as you can. That's really going to pique someone's interest, and think about what they want to hear, and taking out some of the buzzwords, what it is you do that's interesting. This was an interesting view that I deduced recently. Very early stage companies are going to talk about their market, and that holds true an awful lot of the time. When I go through company pitches or in conversations with chief execs, if they spend a lot of time talking about the market that they're planning to go after and how it's a great big market, and they're explaining to me about emissions and electric vehicles, or how content is moving online and you can't, professional rights media companies can't access it, that's really great. But then there's a little bit of time that talks about the product, and that means it's at a very early stage, and that seems to hold true. If you're actually pitching the product, that's great, again, but it does mean it means you're further along and you're on your way. But again, it means that you're probably at quite a startup stage. If you're pitching the pain, that really gets people's interest. So this is when you can talk about the issue that 3 of your major corporate customers had, and they turn to you, and this is why they turn to you, and this is what you fix for them. You can see how a more mature company would be able to give that type of discussion. So not just how you say it, but what you say can actually give an indication quite early on as a tell, if you like, of what stage the company is, and then what to expect. So what I would say as well, in terms of getting your message across, you're a black box, or a mauve purple one. It's who cares and why. What is the USP of what you do? And that might be what you ultimately want to do. It could be what you want to achieve, what you're aiming for. Get that vision across, and then you can explain how far along you are, rather than stand at the bottom, build up a picture, and hopefully they'll see the peak of the mountain. Well, they can't. They're looking up and they can't see the peak, and they don't know how much more you're going to add on top and how big the hill's going to be. Is it a mountain, or is it a small hill? And if you just keep adding in a bit more information, then they're waiting for the next. If you start at the top and say, this is the peak, and it's very evident it's the peak, they can see just how big this is all looking. And then you can say, by the way, we're 20 feet up there. So what's the USP, and the why and the how? Interestingly, if you can get across the why, then the how is really the next bit, but it's all about getting people on a hook. You don't want people to be curious about what you do. You want them to be convinced what you're doing is great. And then if they want to and get into detail, how are you doing it? And that could be through the people, the partners, and the connections. So the how, it means they're already over the line to some degree. If they're questioning why you're even bothering, then you're at a much earlier stage in convincing someone of what it is you're doing. So this is how the venture capital unit pulls together our bullet point pitches as well. So we work with teaser information, and this is typically what we like to hone things down to as well. So it's really that one line that grabs attention, a little bit more detail about the who cares and why, and then background, actually getting inside that box and saying, well, where are we in this? So where is the company in terms of potential revenues or pipeline? And be careful about how you get that across as well. Do try and be as explicit as you can. I've seen slides that had Apple on the customer slide, only to find out that actually Apple wasn't a customer. But hopefully there would be one day, and we'd emulate the way that they ran their stores. So but at the same time, I've seen slides with logos on, and they put it on the same slide saying customers and pipeline. And to an investor, there's a massive difference between a customer and a pipeline. A pipeline could be everyone you met at a conference. A customer is someone who pays. And again, it's worth working out what they pay. How much are they committed? Are they paying for an actual trial? And when you say trials, of course, don't forget that people will accept free trials. So is it a paid trial? That all these things are indicators that show just how far along you are, how much you command the destiny of the company. And that's the end of my quick run through of pitching. I hope that might have been interesting. Are there any questions?
Yeah, let's see. Thank you, Roy. Before we now begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation, just a quick reminder that you can still submit your questions through your questions pane on your right-hand side in the attendee control panel. First question we have is from Gary. At what stage is your startup SME ready for an international audience?
Good question. Thank you, Gary. Typically, it's going to be around a raise of a few million, I would say. Sorry, I keep saying and it's really around the level of maturity that's going to gain interest. I showed a slide earlier, and I'll try and go back to it, that showed level of maturity in customers. And I think that's really the telling one, because if you're not capital intensive, so if you're a digital company and you're doing a raise of 2 million, you're probably going to be starting to deploy overseas, in which case you're probably going to be relevant to an international audience because they'll be able to see a hockey stick. If you're conversely, so if you imagine a diagonal line through all this, conversely, if you're a life science company, by the time you've actually got something relevant to a life science investor, you're going to be really early stage. You might have still burned through quite a lot of cash. It could be 3, 5, 10 million, maybe even earlier, but you'll have discovered something through all the work in R&D that's going to be really relevant and transformational in that sector. So the more intellectual intensity that there is in the company and the product, I think it depends, but it will be reflected in the amount that you're looking to raise. So typically the million or a couple of million is probably around the tipping point when you're going to be relevant for an international audience.
Thank you. Another question came in from Samit. As a GEP company, how can we get the funding support?
Well, I guess it depends what sort of funding. If it's funding in terms of support of venture capital unit, that's an open door. So we just need to have a look at a teaser pitch, understand the company, understand the UK activities and the HQ, and then look at how we can hone out the messages and engage some investors.
Thank you. And next question right now is the last question. So if you have any more, please type them in right now. And the next question comes from Manuel. And the question is the pitch for a CVC similar to VC?
Again, very interesting question. It varies quite considerably because some corporate venture funds will actually operate very much on a commercial basis. So a CVC might actually be looking and have the same level of interrogation and looking for the same messages as a VC. Others will be more interested in the USP and the technology aspects of that, the differentiator, rather than the financials of the company. So it's a sliding scale, if you like. But typically, a corporate VC in general, they're aligned to their strategy. So it's good to have things in the pitch which do align to the sorts of customers they're in, the sort of sectors they're in. and then you can talk about the potential for those customers, because they're going to know their customer base very, very well and understand whether you've got something new and relevant and valuable to their customer base and strengthens their position as well. A VC, on the other hand, will be very interested to know how quickly you can get to financial returns.
Thank you. Another question from Matt here. You talk a lot about the why. How are you weighing this in importance against empirical data, etc., when pitching?
Blimey, I'll have to try and think about empirical data. I talk a lot about the why, as in why the company's doing this, and that's going to be messages from the market or what the market need might be. If you're doing more of a proposition push, so there isn't a ready-made demand, then that's already an indicator that's going to be something you need to do a lot of the groundwork to introduce to the market. If I could ask you, maybe if I haven't answered your question, just resubmit it, because it'd be good to understand that empirical data aspect. And if I haven't answered it, I'd certainly like to spend more time on that.
Thank you. Another question from Michelle here. How are successful Kickstarter or crowdfunding campaigns looked upon by investors?
Wow, good questions. So typically, I mean, obviously, depending on which platform you use, it can be a really messy capital table. Crowdfunding can be useful in the right way. So if you've got something which takes quite a lot of capital, if you're happy without, hardware, real things to touch, and you've done a crowdfunding campaign, then that means that you might have raised something interesting, but don't forget that the funders in crowdfunding are taking very small stakes, very low risk, and with very little understanding of the company and its ability to actually execute its plans. So crowdfunding at that level is actually, I'd almost say, seen negatively. It's almost like your last resource, because it hasn't been through the scrutiny of going through other investment routes. And we've seen notable failures on crowdfunding platforms. And again, this is for something which has a real differential, and it's on a hockey stick. It's got a great global addressable market. It's going to be big exports. So that's where my focus is. Obviously, the companies that are really going to be, motoring. I look at sites like Indiegogo. There are novel things, but as soon as they look interesting, if they were really going to be making, really big companies, they'd be easily copied at the first sight of that. At the end of the scale, you can use crowdfunding sometimes to validate the customer base, and in the very early stages. So if you've got some sort of new dev box or bit of code, it's quite useful to get people on board with that. If you've got a new cryptocurrency and you go out to the market and you get a lot of people on board, that's going to demonstrate that there's a desire out there and enough people are actually interested in this. And especially if that's going to be your route to growth as well.
Thank you. Matt added something to his question about that empirical data, and he added subject matter expertise and data about the industry, market size, comparables, competition.
So I think a lot of that comes into the why. Certainly, it depicts the space that you're moving into, but competition is certainly a difficult one. We see no end of axes and charts that show nobody in your competition space, and you've used a whole slide or a whole minute of conversation to say we don't think there's any competition, which isn't even useful to know, because actually I want to know what you've got and why, because the investor probably knows a little bit about it as well. Subject matter expertise is great, but it's further down the chain. So if you say you're going to launch a new random number generator that uses quantum physics, brilliant. Again, I'm pitching the product. I haven't pitched the market, and I haven't pitched the actual expertise and the pain. So in that, I'd like to know that you've got the right people who can deliver on that product. But what I really want to know is, well, why are you developing that product? So that's where the subject matter would certainly fit into that chain. I'd certainly look at the market size, absolutely. In the best of cases, they're kind of obvious that they're big. What's 2 billion versus 3 billion? But it's large addressable markets, I think, speak for themselves. Knowing your competition is always good, but you've probably got something which is it's just ideally a no-brainer when you can get that across.
Thank you. Next question here from David. Very early stage startup, looking for seed funding at this time. How do I get to meet potential funders interested in smaller investment amounts?
Well, it'll be worth looking at which sector you're in and whether there are any schemes involved in that area. So there are various UK competitions run by interested parties, KPMG, startup competitions, Cambridge Wireless. These types of organizations run competitions to give you a bit of recognition, and some of them bring in investors as well. So they're a useful way of promoting yourself and getting through that validation. There's also the British Business Angels, and there are angel networks around the country that can be relevant. So I guess it depends where you are in the country. So the geography, which vertical you're in, which market you're in, because there are various funds that might work in that space as well. Yes, some of the more central resources like British Business Angel Association might be helpful in directing you to that.
Thank you. Next question from Anne here. What do you think is the timeline to raise an international series around these days?
It varies wildly. So if you're really in the sweet spot and you've got some very wealthy people with very little management at the top, because they are the management, you can move very quickly. You're talking months. Sometimes things can drag on much longer though, and I mean our typical average would be 6 months, but you can be going a year if there's all sorts of nuances. So no one's walking away from the table, but it's taking a long time to get approvals and get traction. One of the things I would say, actually, one of the things that we do aim to do in BCU is to highlight companies to build some of these relationships, even when maybe the company isn't raising, but it's about to raise, and try and warm up some of these conversations. And certainly we've done that with GE, where we put together a pitch day, and some of the companies they met, they weren't actually looking for investment. And you think, well, what's the point in that? Well, actually, if they were ever going to make an investment, they'd want to know the company and the product and have sight of some of the trials. So we're trying to build those relationships so that when the funding round comes along, it's a much easier and comfortable conversation.
Thank you. Another question here from Anne. Do you think Brexit has an effect already, in brackets, on UK-based companies raising early stage funds?
I don't know, is the question. So we've seen some investors slow down, and I think we've seen more investors accelerate. And certainly deals that were happening at the time that Brexit was announced, they actually got more investment because of the way the pound was working. But I think a lot of people are still see the UK as extremely strong and generating a lot of really good, interesting companies that are going to go global. I think the only time where it could have any negative effect is where you're looking and you're reliant on a totally European market, and then there's uncertainty in that. But most of the time, if you've got something with a strong USP, then it'll be in demand, it'll be wanted by corporate companies in Europe, and I wouldn't see Brexit having a major influence if actually you bring a lot of value add to what it is they're doing.
Thank you. And next question here from Michelle again. When you said it depends on the crowd funds, is Indiegogo looked less favorably than others, such as Kickstarter? For example, are there more reputable ones that investors look at for credibility?
So at the stage that we look at companies when you're doing your venture rounds, I don't think so. I mean, the amounts that are raised on crowdfunding are usually much smaller than VCs get a look at, and they are. I don't see any difference between Indiegogo or Kickstarter. It's more about you've got a proposition for a certain number of people, and they took a small risk in it. Don't forget, crowdfunding is, on one hand, it can demonstrate that people are initially interested in what you're doing, but that's going to people with a very low risk appetite, as opposed to someone who's really spent a lot of time understanding everything about the proposition in the company. So there's a kind of a credibility negative about crowdfunding, but I haven't seen any differentiators between particular platforms.
Thank you. No other incoming questions right now. Anything you want to add before we close the session, Roy?
Only to say thank you, everyone, for joining. I hope it was interesting, and good luck going forwards.
Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. Once you leave today's session, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you would complete that and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with the link to view recording of today's webinar. On behalf of DIT and our presenter, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.